afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Natalia Aleksiun. I'm the Harry Rich Professor of Holocaust Studies and Bad Shorstein, the director, interim director of the Bad Shorstein Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Florida. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's program, American Jewish Politics in an Age of Global Turbulence, part of our Forum for Fairness in Discourse lecture series, the last one this academic year. The Forum for Fairness in Discourse was created to bring together public intellectuals and scholars into conversations, both academic with academic and general community, about how Jewish thought, history, and contemporary experience intersect with pressing questions of justice, identity, ethics, and collective responsibility. At a moment marked by renewed debates, we believe that such conversations are not only timely, but they are essential. This series is made possible through the generosity of Audrey Adams and Dr. John D. Morris. Their support creates a space in which we can engage with historical experience, with contemporary Jewish questions, and with questions that shape a more thoughtful present and future. We're deeply grateful for their commitment to sustained intellectual dialogue. We hope they are with us online. We're especially fortunate to welcome tonight, or today really still, our host Joshua Leifer, a journalist and historian whose work speaks directly to the political and moral crossroads confronting American Jewish life. Joshua is a columnist for Haaretz, and his essays and reporting has appeared in the New York Times, in New York Review of Books, The Guardian, The Atlantic, The Nation, all the many important influential venues. It's red. Okay. His first book, Tablets Shattered, The End of an American Jewish Century and the Future of Jewish Life, won a National Jewish Book Award. It offers a sweeping and intimate reflection on what he calls the Jewish century, the roughly 100 years following the 1924 U.S. Immigration Act, which effectively closed the era of mass Jewish immigration to the United States. Leifer argues that the apex of American Jewish life, as shaped by the post-war liberal consensus, may now have passed. Yet he remains cautiously hopeful, and I hope we'll hear more about it. The metaphor of tablets shattered recalls the biblical moment when the first tablets were broken, only to be replaced by a second set, suggesting rapture, not a finality, but a transformation. Joshua is also currently a doctoral candidate in history at Yale University, and his research sits at the intersection of modern intellectual history, Jewish political thought, US policy, and Holocaust memory, and I hope we'll have you back to discuss your new work. We are also privileged to have in conversation with Joshua Leifer, Professor Rachel Gordan, Associate Professor of Religion and the Shorstein Professor of American Jewish Culture and Society here at the University of Florida. Professor Gordan received her PhD from Harvard University in North American Religion, her BA from Yale in American Studies, and her MAR from Yale Divinity School. She held postdoctoral fellowships at Northwestern University and the University of Toronto. This mic will not cooperate with me. And previously taught at Boston University Judaism literature, an introduction to Judaism literature of the 1940s and 1950s, illuminating how middlebrow publishing reshaped Jewish identity. Oh, at last. Reshaped Jewish identity in the United States. The book was a finalist for the 2025 Jordan Schnitzer Book Award in Modern Jewish History and Culture. Together, Joshua Leifer and Rachel Gordan invite us to reflect on both continuity and rupture in American Jewish life, on the legacies of the post-war settlement, the fragility of liberal pluralism, and the evolving meanings of Jewish political identity in the age of global turbulence. Please let me welcome together Joshua Leifer and Rachel Gordan in conversation.
Thank you, Professor Alexium. Josh, it's so great to have you here. As someone who teaches and studies and writes about American Jews, it's been really fun for me to get to talk with you. And I wanted to say congratulations. This is Josh's book, his first book. It's a very attractive book. It's also very impressive for a first book to have garnered this much attention and praise. I think even people who disagree with some of your arguments found it, thought-provoking and a really enjoyable read. You can purchase it wherever you purchase books, and it is very readable. So I wanted to open with a question that my students say they often want to ask guests, which is, why did you write this book?
There's an interesting answer to that question. There's a less interesting answer to that question. I think I'll give you the interesting one since you're all here, and I'll just say it's a huge honor to be here at this university and in front of this amazing crowd and the turnout in the middle of the day. It's like a real treat for a speaker, and feel very fortunate to have been invited here and to be part of this conversation with such accomplished interlocutors. The book initially grew out of my attempt to take stock of the very substantial, or what I perceived to be, very substantial political changes within American Jewish life that had taken place during the, roughly during the first Trump presidency. It had seemed to me like the actual divisions within American Jewish life had shifted fairly substantially between, say, 2015, when Trump first descended the golden escalator, and then by the time he left office. And that was true about American politics, but also true about American Jewish politics vis-a-vis Israel. It also seemed to me that new forms of Jewish practice had emerged in tandem with some of those political changes, new forms of Jewish ritual, new kinds of prayer groups in the Minyanim, and study groups were popping up with certain kinds of political and cultural orientations that I think seemed new, at least to me. And so I wanted to try to make sense of where that energy was coming from, what it was a response to, and what it might mean for the future of American Jewish life.
I guess part of your explanation is explaining these three pillars of American Jewish life. Maybe you can explain for our audience what those are.
Sure. So I was, we could say, methodologically interested in the ideological consensus that had kept American Jewish life together, and that seemed to be both collapsing and being challenged, and that the proof of that was in these new manifestations of Jewish practice. Mm-hmm. And to me, it seemed like there were three pillars of what I call the post-war American Jewish consensus. The first was Americanism. And what I mean by Americanism in the book is a certain kind of American Jewish exceptionalism, the idea that America is the greatest country on earth, and that America's exceptional goodness is confirmed by the Jewish experience, both within the United States, the Jewish experience from immigration to integration, as well as America's foreign policy role, vanquishing the Nazis during World War II, and then becoming sort of the guarantor of Israel's security, and in some sense, the security of Jews globally during the Cold War and after. The second pillar, to my mind, was Zionism. And by Zionism, I don't mean like this thing that everyone's debating right now, one state, two states. That's part of Zionism in the book. But what I meant by Zionism was really the idea that American Jews had that Israel's creation was the telos, the kind of foreordained culmination of all of Jewish history, and that Israel also represented in miniature the same values that American Jews held on their own. And by virtue of that perfect fit between American Jewish and Israeli values, that Israel was in some sense a moral exemplar on the world stage and for Jews that they could look to and be inspired by. The third pillar in the book is liberalism. This is the pillar that I get the most criticism for. And I think I probably could have been more precise in retrospect. But what I mean by liberalism in the book is actually not political liberalism, but religious liberalism. And by religious liberalism, I mean an approach to religious identity and practice that has three characteristics. The first is that religious liberalism, the individual rather than the community is the primary unit of practice. So, for instance, in traditional religion, let's say, or traditional Judaism, the community, the klal, is sort of the pace setter of religious practice. But in religious or in liberal forms of Judaism, the individual became the operative unit of religious practice. People ask, what is meaningful to me personally as an individual about religious practice? Second component of this religious liberalism was that the logic of religious participation was switched from obligation under the traditional Jewish conception, so mitzvah or chiyuv, to choice. I am not doing these things, let's say, going to synagogue or having a Passover Seder because I think that I'm commanded to do these things, but because I choose to do these things. I want to do them, and they're subjectively meaningful to me, and so I choose to do them. And the third part of religious liberalism was a certain kind of relativism as a result of these other two components, which meant that American Jews suddenly had a problem explaining, say, to their children why they should be Jewish rather than any of the other religious identity options on the kind of marketplace of experience in the United States. If you're really a liberal pluralist and everything is equally good and everything is equally valid, and who am I to judge another person for what they do, then how do you say, no, it's actually, I think it's better if you did this over that? And so that's how the pillar of liberalism crumbled. Now, I think it's more obvious to people how the Zionism pillar and the Americanism pillar, as parts of a consensus, began to crumble. Israel became a much more fraught place politically, and I would argue today is the greatest source of division among Jews rather than the greatest source of unity, as it was, let's say, at the peak of kind of the Zionist consensus. But also Americanism started to be challenged. I think that for American political progressives, Americanism was challenged very profoundly by the Trump presidency when it seemed like some of the manifestations of right-wing populism, political anti-Semitism, political violence that I think many Americans associated with something not from this country started to appear. But then I also think that the post-October 7th landscape and the resurgence of political anti-Semitism, this time coming from the left and then again from the right with Tucker Carlson and Nick Fuentes, has really challenged an idea that I think many American Jews held, which was that America is different. That America is immune to the pathologies of anti-Semitism that marked the old world. And so all of these shifts combined, I think, created an environment of tremendous flux and instability, and is sort of the background to those phenomena that I wanted to chart in the book.
Since you mentioned the breaking down of some of these kind of seem a little bit like mid-century myths. I feel like they're kind of at their peak in the post-war era. But it seems like the breaking down of them might have been in the past 20, 25 years, especially. And that's also coincides with this era that people are now calling kind of the end of the golden era of American Jews. So in my understanding of that, the golden era of American Jews is kind of post-World War II until the end of the 20th century. The 90s may be especially strong. I'm curious if, since we all get asked this, but do you think it's the end of the golden era of American Jews?
So I have a two-pronged response to that question. So the journalist Frank Foer for The Atlantic wrote this article where I think like he put into maybe outside academic consciousness the golden era phrase. And I have two disagreements with that. One, I don't think the golden era was so golden. And that's part of the process that I chart in the book, that yes, it's true. American Jews enjoyed a tremendous amount of material prosperity and political stability in this period. It is when most of what we know about, most of what we consider to be American culture, American Jewish culture, bagels and lax, whatever, I don't find those things meaningful, but some people do. And when that stuff took shape, but I actually think that came at a tremendous cost to the ability to build, came at a tremendous cost to our ability to build sustainable and meaningful Jewish communities, that perhaps the price of fitting Judaism into the mid-century mold was actually quite high, and that what ended up happening at the end of the Golden Age, so to speak, was that some of the arrangements that American Jews had made to allow them, I would say, to not think so much about their Judaism in America, those arrangements began to fray. And all of a sudden, American Jews had to grapple with questions that they had, whether consciously or not, tried to leave behind. So there's this quote that I love from the literary critic Irving Howe, he's writing specifically about what Israel and Zionism did for American Jews. But I think one could equally say this about Americanism or religious liberalism, where he says that Israel and Zionism enabled American Jews to postpone that great reconsideration of their Jewishness that the American condition required. So as long as, say, American Jews could tell themselves, I'm a good Jew, I donate to the UJA appeal, and I don't think too much about what's going on in Israel, so that I might not get disturbed by it, or American values and Jewish values are absolutely the same, and nothing about my experience has proved to me that to be not the case. It was very easy for people to not have to deal with the kind of deep questions. What does it mean to be Jewish in modernity? How do you reconcile inclusivity and commitment to the tradition? All those questions were kind of put to the side. They were reopened as these pillars began to crumble. So I bristle a little bit at the Golden Age, just because and this is also related to the title that I chose for the book, about tablets shattered and the possibility of the creation of something new. The Golden Age implies that what's going to come after the Golden Age is necessarily going to be worse than what was. There was a Golden Age, and now there's the not Golden Age. I don't think that the Golden Age was so golden. I'm also not so convinced that what's going to come after the Golden Age is necessarily going to be worse. The book is not a super optimistic book, but it's not declensionist in a deterministic way. I would say, I don't think it has to be the case that things will be worse.
Yeah, I mean, when historians of American Jews refer to a golden era, they sometimes specifically refer to the 1950s, so among American Jewish historians. And I think they're often pointing out how here we are just not even a decade after World War II, and things are so much better. Jews have more solidly moved into the middle class. Things you were talking about, you and I have talked about how Jews become really accepted as one of America's major American religions, which is just this incredible turnaround from having been considered a kind of subhuman race previously to being one of the big three. Historians sometimes call this Protestant Catholic Jew America era. Yes. But so it sounds like you're saying there was a cost to this change in status or upgrade in status. And if you could just be a little more particular about what are the costs of that?
So I think one cost is that trying to fit Judaism into the American confessional model stripped Judaism of some of the things that make it coherent. Like Judaism is not only a religion; it's also it's a people. It's an ethnicity. I mean, there are other words, and so Catholicism is Catholics are not a people, and they're not an ethnicity. And so by having to fit into that mold, I think Jews got deprived themselves in some instances of the language to talk coherently about collective Jewish identity. I also think that part of the making Judaism into a parallel of Christianity also sanded down what makes Judaism distinct as a religion also, which is that it's centered on a normative set of divine obligations. Now, you don't have to believe that those obligations are divine, but it happens to be that as a set of practices that developed over time, you can't understand Judaism without halakha. You might not want to observe halachically, but it remains the case that you can't really understand why Jews do anything without reference to the thousands of years of Jewish legal discussion. And that also, in some ways, I think, was put to the side because Judaism became a faith, like Christianity. But Judaism is not a faith like Christianity. In fact, one of the fascinating things about Judaism as a legal corpus is that even if you believe in other things, it still considers you a Jew. Now, there's whatever we can get into the complexity of that also, but it's not simply a faith on the other models. So, and then I would argue that if those are kind of ideological costs or theological costs, the other one was sociological, which is that the process of integration into suburbia and then meant the elimination of some of the thick older forms of community that had made Jewish life possible. And the kind of traditional bonds that on which communal practice depends began to be frayed in the atomizing suburbs of the United States. That might have been okay, let's say, for mainline Protestantism, although it also turned out not to be. Like the death of communal religion and associational practice has also affected Christianity. But I think that it was especially damaging to Judaism.
Since we mentioned this isn't all a negative view, have there been places or times in American Jewish history where you see encouraging signs of revival or returning to some of what was abandoned in the mid-20th century?
Yeah, so I definitely I don't want to paint this wholly negative picture. And one thing that I think you could say is that if you map, now there may be demographers or political scientists, sociologists who disagree with me, and I welcome contention here. I think, though, if you map Jews onto immigrants who came from other places at the same time in the 1880s, 1924, and you compare, let's say, their descendants, those immigrants' descendants, like Jewish descendants, to their maybe Irish or Italian or Polish descendants, the amazing thing is that people are still Jews. Like, there are very few, let's say, Italian or Polish Catholics whose great-great-grandparents arrived in 1880 who still have a nostalgic attachment to Polish or Italian, or necessarily like see themselves as part of an ethnic community. That's not true, and that's not true of American Jews. So I think, like, in some ways, that's an amazing. There's a story here about the amazing endurance of Jewish identity, something that people continue to positively ascribe to, despite the forces that militating against that. Today, I think that there are a lot of very interesting attempts to rediscover parts of traditional Judaism, rediscovery of the Talmud through progressive lenses. These are things that I write about in the book. That's on maybe the progressive side, or people wanting to, people who are finding in Judaism a language for social justice protests, whether that's against deportations in Minneapolis or against what Israel is doing in Gaza. And then I also think that on the other side, like, I'm not an Orthodox triumphalist, and I actually don't think that the majority of Jews will ever be Orthodox, and I don't think that Orthodoxy is will dominate American Jewish life. But Orthodoxy, because Judaism in America, who is Jewish in America is determined by who is doing Jewish in America. And if you are not doing Jewish in America, it's very hard to influence the conversation about what it means to be Jewish in America. The people who are doing Jewish very consistently and demographically growing are the Orthodox. So one of the communities that I profile in the book also is it's specifically ultra-Orthodoxy, but I think more generally there is a kind of tendency in America that didn't have a name before that's that I call it separatist Orthodoxy, because it includes people who are maybe attended, this is micro-sociology, but like who attended modern Orthodox institutions but are not modern Orthodox in their relationship to important questions about, let's say, gender or politics. And if you go to certain places, Florida is actually one of them, you will see a kind of non-progressive, non-modern Orthodoxy. That's also not ultra-Orthodoxy, and that's not politically, and that's also very politically right-wing, that is taking up that's occupying a much bigger part of the Jewish conversation. It will never be the majority, and people are always surprised to learn that, like, if you include all forms of Orthodoxy in the United States, Charedim, Hasidim, modern Orthodox people, it's maybe 10% of Jews. But the fact that it's only 10% of Jews, but has the visibility that it does, to me, it goes back to this, what I said before, that if you want to participate in the American Jewish conversation, you have to be doing Jewish. And it may be the case that, and we know that many, many people in America identify as Jews but don't do Jewish. And that's fine. I'm not making a value judgment against that. But it is a certain kind of exit from contestation over what it means to be Jewish. If you're not doing it, you're not contesting what it means.
One part of this book is your kind of journey through different parts of the Jewish world. Can you tell us a bit about that and how these different communities influenced how you thought about the Jewish experience?
Yeah. So I grew up in northern New Jersey in what I call a mainline affiliated community, which is sort of code for the conservative movement. And I was probably in like the right-leaning side of the conservative movement. In fact, you could tell this whole book as kind of like what happens when the conservative movement falls apart. Like, where does its members go? In some sense, and one of the, like, you will find in the book in all of the different tendencies, maybe with the exception of Lithuanian ultra-Orthodoxy, graduates of conservative institutions. So, for instance, in the chapter that I have about postmodern queer Talmud and the creation of an organization called Svara, which teaches Gemara through a queer lens, the person who founded it is Rabbi B'nai Lappi, who's a JTS graduate. Anyway, this is sort of inside Jewish baseball, but in some ways, talking about the decline of the conservative movement is really a proxy for talking about the decline of this consensus, because conservative Judaism took itself to represent the middle ground, the moderate middle of American Jewish life. All that being said, as I left the community that I grew up in. I went to Israel after college. I was in a pre-military academy. There I sort of confronted the reality of politics in Israel. It's warts, but also I received an incredible political education, and it was probably one of the most significant experiences of my life to be kind of through experience joy in what we might call the Israeli peace camp. And since I'm now 32, that was when I was 17. So since then, I've been also a participant in some sense in Israeli progressive politics. Then I went back to the United States, went to university, discovered that if you grew up like me in the kind of right wing of the conservative movement, you had sort of two choices for how you were going to probably go. You either would stop being observant or you'd become modern Orthodox. The combination of moving through the world of Orthodoxy, which also was a product of me marrying my wife, who grew up in an ultra-Orthodox community, and getting to know her family as well, and also my involvement in left-wing politics, basically, both as a student and then you might say progressive journalism after I graduated. All of those experiences are kind of woven through the book and exposed me to parts of the American Jewish world that when I was 17 and still in high school I had no idea existed, but then made me realize just how provincial my own sense of what being Jewish had been, coming from a suburb in northern New Jersey.
And the book was finished before October 7th, but how did October 7th then change things for you Jewishly?
So the book manuscript was submitted to, the final book manuscript was submitted to my editor basically a week before October 7th. And when we woke up to what had happened, my editors checked in afterwards. I initially said, I don't know what to do. Let's just publish it as it is. World events have overwhelmed this book and it's over. My editors and said to me, no, you have an obligation to update this in light of also what I had gone through, which was a very substantial political rupture with the part of the progressive world that I had been in previously over reactions to October 7th. And I ended up rewriting close to 20,000 words of the book. Actually, almost the entire chapter 6, I think it is, which is the diasporic double bind, was not in the first version of the book. And, in terms of Jewish practice, I don't think October 7th changed so much for me, but it did lead to a certain rethinking about my own politics and my own relationship to Israel and Zionism that I think I'm still working through now. And some of that is recounted in the book, especially the afterword, where it talks about my break with American progressives. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah. Relatedly, this is not a book on how to be Jewish. I was telling Josh that I saw this book somewhat in the tradition of what I call introduction to Judaism books. These books became very popular in the mid-20th century. These were books with titles like Basic Judaism by the conservative Rabbi Milton Steinberg, and the novelist Herman Wouk wrote one called This Is My God, published in 1959, became a popular bar mitzvah gift. And Herman Wouk's example of it also has some memoirish elements he weaves in his own life. And you do that too so wonderfully here. So I did want to ask if you could tell us about how you've heard if the book has operated as a kind of model for other Jews who've read it and how to navigate this moment of being Jewish.
Yeah, so it's funny. I mean, I have a little ambivalence about the book's situation in that tradition, in part because when I first was writing it, I wanted it to speak to a wider audience. Initially, the book was pitched as a book about American Jewish identity to American progressives, how American progressives can understand the political changes that are happening in Jewish life. Partially as a result of October 7th, but even before, it became clear that American progressives were not going to read this book, or were not going to be the primary audience for this book. On the other hand, it's funny that you use Milton Steinberg and Herman Wouk as an example, because those are both writers that I grew up on. And Herman Wouk, both This Is My God, but also The Winds of War, his sort of monumental multi-series or book that was turned into a multi-series TV show. that was the story in some sense of like American Jewish life that that my father taught me, and also as a driven leaf more than basic Judaism, I would say, was a curriculum book for me growing up. And when I set out writing, I did think about those books in that tradition, although a little bit more along the lines of Irving Howe's World of Our Fathers as a kind of conscious book that I wanted this book to be in dialogue, self-consciously writing as someone roughly who would be the age of Irving Howe's grandchildren, or grandchild. But I wanted the book to be about politics. And even now, it dismays me a little bit to see it in like the religion and spirituality section. And I think that it just has to do with like the way that Judaism gets slotted into like the American genre like definition. Like, oh yeah, this is about religion. It's not about politics. All that being said, one of the most surprising. So let me just go back to, but I did want the book to provoke people to think more seriously about their Jewish identities. So in that sense, it did share something with that Intro to Judaism lineage, and that even if I didn't always like the way that they did it, or I came to have some criticisms of the kind of rhetoric that Wucher Steinberg used, I thought that actually American Jewish life was intellectually impoverished by the absence or the decline of that middle brow Jewish writing, taking religious ideas seriously, taking political ideas seriously, and then kind of confronting American Jews with them and saying, well, what do you think? To me, by the time I was growing up, like there wasn't any successor to Wook. Like my father had also grown up on that, and I also grew up on it, but it wasn't like there had been in the late 1990s and 2000s a new iteration really of those kinds of books. And I think, and my sense was that there needed to be, and there should be. So I did write in that way of trying to get Jews to take ideas about Judaism seriously. I often say this, it strikes one of the weird things about American Judaism or American Jews. I mean, there are many weird things, but one of the striking things is that American Jews pride themselves on academic success, on intellectual rigor, professors, doctors, lawyers, rabbis. But when it comes to Judaism and Jewish ideas, American Jews are willing to accept a very thin, very superficial relationship to their religious identity. Like, rigor is the norm in every other field, maybe, except for this one, where people kind of want, whatever makes me feel, well, it's a kind of pragmatic, shrugging relationship to the content. So one of the weird, encouraging things that has happened since the book was published is that people write to me and say that they read the book and then they decided to get more involved in Jewish life. They started an independent minyan, or they decided to be the gabbai at their synagogue, or they started learning a regular book, like texts or a book club with other Jews. Like, that was never the intention of the book, but I'm also glad that that has been the response that some people have had.
This sense you have that Jews do not struggle with or even want to take religion so seriously. In your book, you describe how earlier in the 20th century, I think maybe in the 30s and 40s, Jews are just so busy trying to make it in the process of becoming, and I always explain this in my teaching too, that they're not really middle class yet, and they're not professionals yet. So there's just kind of that struggle to make it. But in the post-World War II era, when we're becoming a more educated and socioeconomically upward group in the U.S., I'm wondering about the explanations for that, besides the point that everyone is secularizing in the last third of the 20th century. Why else do we think this is that Jews have been satisfied with, as you said, something that seems thinner religiously?
Well, I think part of it has to do with the way that Judaism has been made to fit into a confessional box in America that it doesn't easily fit into. What I mean by that is that many millions of Jews came over to the United States. Not all of them, but a significant number of them came from a different political tradition, like a Yiddish socialist tradition, so to speak, which had a conception of Jewish collectivity. And Irving Howe actually has a beautiful essay called "The End of Jewish Secularism" that he delivered like months before he died, where he kind of talks about how you had this culture that in some ways was built as a revolt against religion. That Yiddish secularism and Yiddish socialism was a form of an enlightenment process, a way of coming into world culture that Yiddish-speaking Jews experienced in the early part of the 20th century, most of whom had grown up in traditional homes. For many reasons, that political language was lost and will never be recovered. My apologies to the revivalists, Bundist revivalists, if there are any in the room. And so I think that when that political language disappeared, I think American Jews lost an ability to speak about themselves as a collective in that terminology. Zionism fills the gap in some sense. So American Jews can say, well, Israel is the expression of our national identity, which we don't express here in America. Like, we are Americans, but there's a state of the Jews. If Jews aren't a nation, why do they need a state? American Jews are uneasy with that question. So American Jews say Israel has to exist because Jews are a people, but we're not a people that needs a state because we're living in America. There's this ambivalence and tension because American Jews are very uncomfortable with being with nationalism, with Jewish nationalism being a national collective. And the religious language does the trick pragmatically. It gets people into the doors. It keeps people within the institutions. But you can't talk about it too much because it will expose this huge lack of conceptual categories about what it means to be Jewish in modernity. Like, religion works for people also, like ultra-Orthodoxy, because they have a coherent understanding of religion. Religion is much harder also, I think, in the liberal religion because, like, and I think this is a good thing generally, there is a Jewish tradition of questioning and of skepticism. So it's not like conservative and reformed Jews, when asked, like, do you believe in divine revelation at Sinai, will say yes. They will say, I don't know. That's a complicated question. What do you mean by divine revelation? And I think that also, and so not dealing with those questions became very, very comfortable. They're hard. I don't who has the answers to them? They're the biggest questions that exist out there. And so in that way, I also think that, we've canonized Abraham Joshua Heschel, but Heschel was, speaking of the kind of mid-century moment, a very persistent critic of this emptiness of the category of religion in American Jewish life. He's now become a kind of way that, like, looking to Heschel and to the prophetic tradition that he represents, has in some ways become another way of avoiding the theological conversation, even though Heschel himself directed his prophetic critique, when it was directed within the Jewish community, at the evasion of those very questions.
When I was in college, one of my professors at Yale had said to me, Jews don't do theology, we tell stories, which feels like another way around this God talk, which, I mean, as you're describing it, it has often felt like one of the advantages of Jewishness is that it is this large tent that allows in those who are not sure about God, or are atheists even, or want to identify in many ways. Are you offering some kind of judgment or on the fact that Jewishness is this amorphous, that it is possible to opt for the Jewishness that is without God or without halakha, Jewish law that is?
I mean, I think that, like, the idea Jews don't have theology, they have stories, is like one of those beautiful liberal myths about Judaism, which is not historically true at all. As I'll say, like, first my personal stake, and then I'll try to give a little background. But, like, what I would say, I do think this is legitimate to say, don't have theology, but they have law. And I think one of the beautiful things about the halachic system is that and this is how I think about it, if you think of Judaism as an inherited set of legal practices that have been the container for Jewish collectivity, then you don't really have to worry so much about theology, because you just do. You do. And the doing is constitutive of your Jewishness. And so for me personally, certainly the like second order goods of a committed, observant Jewish life are enough on their own for me to say, I think that that's good for me to live. But also I think that pragmatically built in to the Jewish system is a fair amount of latitude about theology within a normative framework of practice. That's for those who are, and this is where I'll get to like the historical aspect of it, that wasn't satisfying for a lot of Jews in like the 19th century going onward either, who said, well, sure, what you're saying is nice mumbo jumbo about about halakha, but actually like why would you follow laws that if you don't think they're if you're not 100% sure they're divinely ordained anyway? That seems like you're living in untruth, and we are Enlightenment people. And Zionism and Jewish nationalism is one of the modern answers to the question of what form does Jewish collectivity take in modernity? How can what we might call like embodied Jewish transmission intergenerationally occur? One way might be through religious practice, but another might be through, instead of encasing Jewish collectivity in law, encasing Jewish collectivity in sovereignty. And so when you think about like the first Zionists and Ben Gurion, and they were adamantly secular because they thought, we solved this problem. We don't need to do all of these really annoying halachic practices because we have a state. And that also is not an option for American Jews unless they want to move. And so I think all of which is to say, like, if there's any time to start thinking really hard about what it is that makes Jewish collectivity coherent in the United States, like this is the moment. And my hope was that the book would not provide answers, but would end with some provocative questions about for people to try to figure out how to think through the moment.
Mm-hmm. So we might get to some of those questions and thoughts from our audience now. So let's see here. We've got a microphone, and if folks do have thoughts or questions for Josh, I see a couple right over here. So maybe we can go to Ellen.
Could you speak a little bit about the political trends with American Jewry? I mean, I grew up at a time when we could count on the Jewish vote being overwhelmingly liberal or democratic, and in Florida, we've certainly seen a huge change in that. Where do you see that going in the future?
It's a great question. I think about it a lot. Sometimes I'm very convinced of that we are in the midst of a Jewish political realignment, but then I become skeptical of that. But I think sort of a meta question that's related to your question is, who counts as politically Jewish? And I'll give an example. By most accounts, the general surveys of American Jews' voting patterns haven't really changed that much. In other words, basically 70%, sometimes higher for Democrats, around 30% for Republicans. Anyone who spends time within American Jewish institutions, a day school board, let's say a federation, a shul, knows that it's not that uneven, the split. It's probably closer, it feels closer to parity, at least. That's what I would argue. Maybe not 50-50, maybe 55-45, maybe even 60-40, but definitely not 70-30 or even 80-20, the way that like the Jewish vote for Barack Obama was. And so the question is then, maybe these perceptions are wrong, or maybe we have to rethink about how we count who is politically Jewish for the purpose of the survey. In other words, whose Jewish identity is salient in their voting decision, rather than saying, I'm just voting as an American. I think that we would come to very different alignments if we disaggregated the question. And it is my perception that within, let's call it, within the affiliated Jewish world, there is a rightward tilt. Part of that has to do with the fact that even if the Orthodoxy only represents maybe 10 or 12% of overall American Jews, within Jews who go to synagogue, that proportion is much higher. Within Jews who donate to Jewish charities, that proportion of Orthodoxy is much higher. Within Jews who send their children to Jewish day schools, the proportion of it is much higher. So the institutions that are producing the character of Jewish life in America do have larger portions of people who are right-wing than they did before. That, I think, is obviously the case. We might also, so then we would have to ask, if that's the case, why has the proportion of Jews who vote for Democrats or Republicans not changed since 1985? Either those general surveys are wrong and they're not counting people the right way, or this is just the perception is wrong. But I think that things have to be, the way we count and think about these things has to be updated for, like, to put it in one, very briefly, like, put it for a world in which non-participation in Jewish life is the norm for maybe the majority of people who are liberal Jews. Like, there's a mass abstention on the part of liberal Jews from the institutions that define American Jewish life. If you want to contest the character of Jewish life, you have to participate in. Otherwise, or you have to build institutions of your own. That also isn't really happening either. But so I mean, one way to putting your question is Florida the future? And it certainly seems like that. Like, right-wing Florida Jewry is being really well represented in American politics right now. Is the Kushner-Witkoff axis a paradigm that's going to be around for a while? I happen to think the answer is yes. I'll say one more thing about this because it really interests me. Like, the Trump administration, by virtue of its very visible and very Jewish proxies, has basically, has in very important ways sidelined the Jewish organizations that used to really matter in American Jewish politics. Like, we can have a long conversation about AIPAC, but like, Donald Trump does not need AIPAC to legitimate his policies. Part of that has to do with his charismatic relationship to his supporters, but I also think it has to do with the changing quality of, or the changing character of Jewish politics. Many of the people, let's say, who are coming out of the right-wing Orthodox world don't operate necessarily through the federations or have circumvented them. I always think of this instance from Trump's first presidency as a really good example, which was that he had a Hanukkah party that got a lot of attention. Maybe it was 2019, where he didn't invite the ADL and he didn't invite the reform or conservative movements, or the Reconstructionist movements. Part of that was like petty politics because their leaders had criticized him for anti-Semitism in the wake of Charlottesville and the things that had happened. But there were groups that were invited instead, and those were Chabad Lubavitch, the Orthodox Union, Agudas Yisrael, and something called the Center for Jewish Values, which is like a sort of pro-life ultra-Orthodox organization. So Trump, in some ways, or what has taken shape, this is not in the book, but I would have liked to have read it more. One of the really interesting things that's happening in American Jewish politics is that there is a right-leaning counter-establishment. Like, the American Jewish institutions, everyone knows this, are run by Democrats. like the American Jewish Committee historically has been a Democratic bastion. Even the Anti-Defamation League was a Democratic bastion. That even if there's now criticism coming from progressive towards those organizations, like by and large, those organizations were Democratic coded. But as American political polarization has seeped into American Jewish life, there's now a right-wing Jewish counter-establishment that is making a bid for power and sidelining, in I think important ways, what we might call the legacy institutions. Sometimes there's also crossover, like maybe the legacy institutions will be led by people who came out of the counter institutions. I don't think it's impossible to imagine a world where people whose primary institutional affiliations are Chabad or Young Israel being national federation leaders. To my knowledge, that hasn't happened yet, but it could. Oh, I mean, actually, a good example of this is that the Trump administration, Deborah Lipstadt was the envoy for anti-Semitism monitoring. I don't remember the exact title under the Biden administration. Under the Trump administration, that role is filled by a man named Yehuda Kapelun, who is an American Israeli Chabad rabbi. I would argue, whatever. This is I'm off on a tangent, but like Chabad is also one of the most interesting organizations right now in American Jewish life, both for its increasing involvement in politics, but also because I made a mistake by not covering it in the book, because Chabad arguably is the Jewish organization that interfaces with the most American Jews nationally. Not anyone, not any other, not AIPAC, not the Federation, not the Reform Movement, Chabad.
I think we had a question over here. Thanks, Dee.
Who's this going to?
Thank you. You mentioned, correct me if I'm wrong, you mentioned that your personal practice and like you see like a value in a personal practice of like halachic observance or maybe something else in that realm as like kind of the due of Judaism, and that can have value as like separate from theology, that like even if you have theology that aligns with it, it's not necessarily core to your practice. I'm struggling to like understand how the majority of, like rational American suburban unaffiliated Jews would be able to subscribe to that or something else closely related to that idea of due without theological, like deep theological change. I guess my question is like, what is like the actual thing that American, like this category of like, I think the majority of American Jews can do to like, I guess, be actively Jewish without a deep religious theological shift?
I don't think they can without a deep shift in some sense. But I'm not. This book was not like a preaching, a proselytizing book. I want people to think more critically about their Judaism. If that takes them to a more observant place, that's great. If it takes them into a non-observance place, but with a deep understanding for Jewish history, I also think that that's a good thing. I mean, I will say though that I think if you spend time in those liberal Jewish institutions, you hear a lot of talk about like a belonging. How do we increase belonging? Jew people today are looking for belonging in their life. It always struck me as curious because belonging isn't, you can't just make belonging. Belonging is a byproduct of things that you do and of a communal structure. And so I think, and this is where I do think that American liberal Jews can learn from or can adopt certain practices associated with more religious tendencies without necessarily having to believe them. And I'll just give a few examples. I mean, there's no reason why only ultra-Orthodox communities have something called a gemach. Basically, philanthropic donation systems for things that people need, whether it's a wedding dress or my wife just had our first child, and so we needed a baby scale. So we went to the baby scale gemach. Like and I think progressives call this mutual aid. There's no reason why that should be the exclusive province of of ultra-Orthodoxy. I'll give another example. Burial societies, Chaver Kadisha. There's no reason why the very important work of guiding a family through the mourning process and taking care of a deceased person's body and taking it to burial should be outsourced from the communities where people live in, which is basically how things work currently in liberal Jewish society. Someone dies and then they send it to the person that's a cemetery, and maybe there's a Chaver Kadisha that's like local there, but it's not, that mourning work isn't done by members of their own community. I mean, the list could go on. Like there's no reason why when people fall sick and need cancer treatment, that liberal Jewish communities can organize what they have in the Orthodox world called a Bikur Cholim, a house where people go and get food and support and can stay when their loved one is in a hospital, maybe far away from where they live. All of these massive mutual aid institutions, which are supported by philanthropy in the Orthodox world, could easily exist in the liberal Jewish world, and it's those things that can create belonging. Belonging is not an abstract thing. Belonging is the feeling that you get when, as you go through the experience of life, there are all of these stations where you get support from your community. That's what creates belonging. I don't really understand how one can create belonging without that kind of like thick care for another, for others that's involved in being in a community.
Yeah, the question was also interesting to me, this because it was, I thought, posing this question of how is it that American Jews do Jewish without understanding why or the theology behind it. And I'm thinking the author we mentioned, Herman Wouk, wrote this very popular bestseller in 1955 called Marjorie Morningstar, and it's about this suburbanizing generation of American Jews in the 50s. And so he has, a young woman named Marjorie who is keeping kosher. So this is one of the Jewish laws. And her less observant or non-Jewish friends are asking her kind of, why do you not eat bacon, or why do you not eat lobster when we go out to these great restaurants? And she doesn't have the words to explain it, but she has the kind of muscle memory of someone who has imbibed these Jewish laws from a Jewish home. And in her Christian majority culture society, this is seen as a failing. She can't explain the theology behind it, but she has grown up in an observant enough home where she knows this is what Jews do. And so some Jews might say, it's enough for me to have the practice of this is what defines my community. We do this, but we don't do that. And I think Woke is kind of advocating for that. That is a way we belong. But I feel like he is sort of pointing out our rational, college-educated, Christian majority culture society does expect us to be able to articulate the why of it now. And so our educated young people kind of need to have that. Yeah,
I absolutely think that we should come up with some more whys for things. I mean, I also don't want to seem like a hardliner here, because it's not true to who I am, and it's not true to how I relate to other people. I mean, there are lots of funny examples along the Marjorie Morningstar line of like American Jews. And one of the rituals that most American Jews do, but don't do it in a halachic way, is a Passover Seder. Which kind of doesn't make sense, but is also one of the examples of like a desire for connection, a desire for meaning, belonging. The Seder is a very communal. It's supposed to be a very group, very klal heavy experience. It's about the people, but like Marjorie's children and grandchildren they're like a few steps attenuated now. So maybe Marjorie was able to have a Seder, but now and her descendants still want to have a Seder, but they're not sure how. Mm-hmm. So in addition to not having the why, I guess I would say, there's also been a loss of the how to do it. I think also that accounts for some of the revivalism that I chronicle in the book. People who it used to be one way, like Jewish people looking at like Jewish trends used to think about some of the like more left-wing stuff as, these are people who disaffiliated and now they're like formerly religious people who are doing queer Torah. But the thing that I discovered was like, it may be true that there are some people who are coming from backgrounds pretty similar to mine, day school, whatever, like we're looking around. But it also is the case that a lot of people are coming to some of those more experimental forms of Jewish identity from much less Jewish background and are saying, the first time I saw a form of Judaism that related to the values that I hold seriously was in these forms, whether it was protest or whether it was in this, in unorthodox forms of Talmud study, that in some ways they had never been afforded opportunities to take Judaism as seriously as they take the other things that they take seriously in their lives. And so they jumped at the opportunity into these things. There may be flaws also in the ideology of those, I think, like, as I write in the book, I'm a little bit skeptical of a Jewish practice that relies only on protesting what Israel does. I don't think that can really build a sustainable Jewish life either. The same goes for forms of Jewish practice that are so open to the changing social norms around, let's say, around identity, that important distinctions that are central to Jewish life get eroded, and then like the coherence of traditional practice is lost. But what's so interesting to me is that people are continuing to seek these things out, in part because they're looking for both the why and the how.
I think I saw some other hands.
I think somebody gave me the mic.
I'm actually reading Marjorie Morningstar right now, so that was like crazy. I have a question related to like Jewish organizations. I think a lot of Jewish organizations and like movements and nonprofits have shifted to being very like anti-Semitism and like pro-Israel for the sake of it, which like in my opinion leads to kind of like a loss of Jewish identity. What are your thoughts on that, and what do you think that means for like the future of American Jewry, like kind of that focus on just being anti-Semitism, not like culturally and religiously Jewish?
Yeah, I mean, this may be a generational thing because I am older than undergraduates now, and so I didn't experience like the height of anti-Semitism. I mean, but I can relate to the other part of your question, which is that when I was a student, it was frustrating that the only thing the organized Jewish community seemed to be interested in was professional Israel advocacy. Like, how would you show that you were a leader in the Jewish community? Well, you would do Right On for Israel, and then you would, join the pro-Israel club on campus. And there left no room, one, for people who, like any other, like had questions or opposition to Israeli policies like they would any other country. If the litmus test is a kind of unconditional support, then if you have a criticism of government policies, where do you fit into the broader Jewish community? Like for my like millennial micro cohort, like that was the fight. Is there space within a Hillel, within the Jewish communal tent, for people who might have views that are like not that different from, let's say, someone who in Israel who votes for a center-left party or like Meretz or something, but for whom within the American Jewish space, because there's so much apprehension around criticism of Israel, there was basically no place to go. In the end, there ended up being no place to go, and most people who had criticisms of Israeli policy like mine ended up outside of the communal bounds. And I make this claim also in the book that I don't think that the level of radicalism of Jewish anti-Israel politics would be what it is today if there had been more space 10 and 15 years ago within American Jewish life for a reasoned, like, let's say, patriotic criticism of Israeli policy. I know for a fact that many of my peers who are now self-described anti-Zionist activists would have liked nothing more than have been able to say, I'm anti-occupation, but also love Israel. That, like, we can use, speaking of a Florida person, the former U.S. ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, likened J Street to Capos. And J Street, I think this was a pivotal moment in this process, and it's also something I write about in Tablet Shattered. The Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations rejection in 2015 or 14 of J Street's belonging, I think, was a very significant moment. Not because I think that J Street is the most important organization in American Jewish life, because it reflected how an organization that is by any means within like the liberal mainstream of Israeli politics, certainly, and Jewish politics in America, was excluded from the umbrella group of Jewish organizations in the United States. So, I mean, I think that I guess I'll just end answering your question by saying that I think that the single-minded focus and intolerance of dissent is ultimately self-defeating for the Jewish institutional world. I think we are where we are now because that policy was so destructive that, like, the situation we're in is where we are.
And very briefly before we wrap, just have one question from the live stream. The question is, aside from AIPAC, is there any organization that can give guidance or tell one which Democratic candidates would support Israel in a realistic and measured way?
Like I said, I think I would make the case, I hope some J Street people are listening. I'd make the case that J Street is able to do that with much more credibility than AIPAC. AIPAC has allowed Israel to hurtle down a path of towards non-democracy that any person who believes in the values of Israel's founding declaration of independence would have rejected. I don't think that AIPAC in its current incarnation is true to that vision of what Israel should be. I think that the candidates that J Street endorses are much more likely to bring America into pushing Israel to be the kind of democratic and Jewish state that we would like to see. You know, and I'm not just talking about Israel's relationship to the Palestinians. I'm also talking about rule of law in Israel, the basic democratic freedoms and norms that have been hugely eroded by the current Netanyahu government, to almost no objection from American Jewish organizations. There have been some exceptions, and a few people have spoken out, but by and large, no serious objection or opposition from American Jews who say, organizations that say they're invested in a democratic Israel. I mean, I think that, like, since we're talking about American Jewish institutions here, like, one of the funniest things to me is that, like, when do American Jews get involved in Israeli politics? There's really only one issue. It actually just came up in the news recently: the Kotel. The only time there's like an all hands on deck meeting of American Jewish leaders of like all the dominant nations and AIPAC and all the organizations is around the ongoing crisis about an egalitarian prayer space by the Western Wall, which is a huge abdication, into my mind, of political responsibility, because it's also symptomatic of the broader like erosion of liberal norms and democratic values happening in Israel generally. But it's like all of this is happening in Israel that's been happening over the last, let's say, 5 years, or we could say. And the only thing you have to say is whether your tourists can come and have their bar mitzvah ceremony on the other side of the wall. My full disclosure, my sister was bar mitzvahed on the egalitarian.